The rumble of a carriage wheel on the cobbled street could make my stomach knot, a cold dread creeping up my spine. A sudden bang, the snapping of a whip, and my heart would leap into my throat, threatening to choke me. Growing up near La Rochelle, I often felt as if the world itself was too loud, too close, too demanding of a presence I simply didn't possess. I was small, yes, but it was my spirit that felt most constricted, shrinking from the boisterous markets and the judgmental glares of strangers. The ground was solid, yet it felt precarious, always threatening to jostle me, to surprise me with its unpredictability. Then came Jean-Pierre. He was a whirlwind, a man whose very existence defied the gravity that kept me so firmly anchored. I met him during one of his demonstrations, a spectacle of silk and gas, a machine that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. While the crowd roared and jostled, my anxiety a familiar hum beneath my skin, my gaze was fixed on the enormous orb ascending into the heavens. It was an escape, a promise whispered on the wind, a silent, soaring defiance of all the things that made me tremble. He was Monsieur Blanchard, the world's first professional balloonist, a visionary who saw not just the sky, but endless possibilities within it. Our marriage, in 1804, was born as much from necessity as from affection. Jean-Pierre, for all his genius in the air, was less adept at managing the earthbound realities of finances. We were drowning in debt, the vibrant hues of his balloon fading against the stark grey of our ledgers. The idea was his, born of desperation, yet delivered with an almost childlike optimism. "Sophie," he'd said, his eyes alight, "the public craves novelty. A woman in the air. It would be unprecedented. It would save us." My first instinct was a familiar tightening in my chest. The crowds, the inevitable roar, the scrutiny, the eyes upon me. It was everything I instinctively recoiled from. But then I looked at Jean-Pierre, at the worry etched around his usually smiling eyes, at the way his hand trembled when he offered me a cup of tea. And I looked at the sky, glimpsed through our grimy window panes, a vast, indifferent canvas of blue. Perhaps, I thought, that indifference was precisely what I needed. December 27th, 1804, Marseille. The day was a blur of nervous energy, a cacophony of shouts, laughter, and the ceaseless murmur of thousands of spectators. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands, encased in soft leather gloves, felt clammy and clumsy. Every jostle from the eager crowd, every sudden cheer, sent a jolt of fear through me. Jean-Pierre helped me into the basket, his touch reassuring, his voice a low, calming hum in my ear. "Just breathe, ma chérie, soon, soon." Then came the ascent. The ropes were cut, the ground receded, and with it, the terrifying crush of humanity. The noise softened, transforming from a jarring shriek to a distant hum. The sensation was not one of falling as I might have imagined, but of rising, of lightness, of an effortless grace I had never known. The wind, which on the ground could whip my skirts and sting my face, here felt like a caress, a gentle push upwards into an infinitely expanding realm. Below, the bustling city shrank into a neat, geometric pattern, its chaos reduced to a harmless order. The colors sharpened, the air grew crisp and clean. It was, as I later described it, an incomparable sensation. Up here, there were no jarring noises, no sudden movements, no jostling crowds. There was only the vast, silent expanse of the sky, the gentle sway of the basket, and the rhythmic beat of my own heart, now calm and strong. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free, truly myself. My fears, those persistent companions, remained tied to the earth, shrinking beneath me until they were but tiny specks, insignificant and powerless. Jean-Pierre smiled at me, a genuine, unburdened smile, and I knew, in that moment, that this was where I was meant to be. The Marseille flight was a success, a financial reprieve, and a revelation. The public was indeed captivated by the sight of a woman in the air, especially one who seemed to shed her earthly anxieties with every foot of altitude gained. We flew together again, the initial novelty giving way to a shared understanding, a quiet partnership in the vastness above. But the debts, like persistent shadows, always returned, requiring more spectacle, more daring. So, on August 18, 1805, I stood alone in the basket, the crowd in Toulouse, a roaring wave beneath me. This was different. This was my flight, my responsibility. The weight of expectation was heavy, a physical pressure. Every eye was on me, waiting for me to falter. The fear, that familiar gnawing dread, tried to reclaim me. But then I looked up at the vast expanse of silk above me, at the sky beckoning, and I remembered that incomparable sensation. I remembered the silence, the freedom. With a deep breath, I gave the signal. The ropes were cut. The ascent was a solitary triumph. I piloted the balloon, adjusting the ballast, managing the valves, every action precise and deliberate. It was an intricate dance with the elements, a conversation between human ingenuity and the boundless power of nature. When I landed, a dizzying mix of exhaustion and exultation surged through me. I had done it. I, Sophie Blanchard, the woman who trembled at a carriage ride, had navigated the heavens alone. I was not the first woman to fly in a balloon. Elizabeth Thibault had that honor decades before me. But I was the first to pilot my own vessel, the first to make the sky my profession, my true calling. Our lives continued as a series of ascents and descents, a constant battle against gravity and debt. The air remained my sanctuary, the ground my challenge. In 1807, a flight took a terrifying turn. We were over a heavily forested area when a sudden squall hit, pushing the balloon violently, tearing at the silk. The descent became a sickening plunge, a terrifying reversal of all the serenity I had come to associate with the air. We crashed hard into a thicket of trees. The impact was brutal, the sounds of snapping branches and tearing fabric deafening. When the jarring stopped, a terrible silence descended, broken only by Jean-Pierre's pained gasp. He was hurt, badly. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a shard of wood had pierced his arm. My own injuries were minor, a few cuts and bruises, but the shock was profound. Yet, even in the midst of the wreckage, my mind remained clear. My fear of noise and chaos seemed to dissolve in the face of true emergency. I moved swiftly, assessing his wounds, calling for help, my hands steady as I fashioned a makeshift splint. On the ground, I was a nervous wreck. In crisis, I was resolute. Jean-Pierre recovered, but the accident left its indelible mark. He never quite regained his old vigor, his movements sometimes stiff, his spirits occasionally shadowed by a lingering melancholy. The daring that had once defined him sometimes seemed to tip into recklessness, a desperate attempt to reclaim a glory that had begun to slip away. The financial pressures never truly abated. We kept flying, but the joy was often tinged with a quiet desperation. Then came 1809. It was during a demonstration, a familiar ascent, a routine that should have been safe. Something went wrong. A miscalculation, a sudden gust of wind, a faulty tether. The reports were conflicting, muddled by panic and shock. All I knew was that I watched from the ground, my heart frozen in my chest, as Jean-Pierre's balloon began to descend too quickly. Too quickly. There was a desperate struggle, a frantic attempt to regain control, and then he fell. A scream tore from my throat, lost in the collective gasp of the horrified crowd. He fell, and the sky, my sanctuary, became a place of profound, unbearable grief. The world seemed to lose its color. The ground beneath my feet felt treacherous, the air stifling. Every loud noise, every jostling crowd pierced me with renewed agony, a reminder of the emptiness in my life. For a time, I thought I would never fly again. What was the point? The man who had introduced me to the sky, who had believed in my quiet courage, was gone. But he had also left me debts, a legacy of financial burden that I could not ignore. And he had left me the sky. Slowly, hesitantly, I began to prepare for another ascent. It was not for the crowds, not for the money, not even for joy at first. It was simply to breathe. My first flight after Jean-Pierre's death was a solemn affair, a quiet communion with the vast emptiness above. I found myself drawn increasingly to night flights. The crowds were smaller, hushed, softened by the darkness. The earth, illuminated by the distant city lights or the silver glow of the moon, took on a magical ethereal quality. Up in the black velvet of the night, surrounded by a million distant stars, I was truly alone. No expectations, no hurried hands, no invasive glares. Only the gentle hiss of the hydrogen, the soft whisper of the wind, and the silent, shimmering tapestry of the cosmos. I would stay aloft for hours, sometimes all night long, a tiny star among giants, drifting with the currents. I perfected the art of lighting fireworks from the basket, releasing cascades of glittering light that rained down on the darkened world below, a silent, blazing defiance against the shadows. On the ground, I was still Sophie Blanchard, the small, nervous woman who started at loud noises and hated carriages. But in the air, under the canopy of stars, I was something else entirely. I was freedom. I was courage. I was the woman who had lost everything, but found her true self suspended between earth and sky, forever fearless in the boundless expanse of the night. My sorrow was a lead weight, yet the sky offered a strange, contradictory lightness. It was during these solitary vigils that I began to refine my techniques, to experiment with the very elements that had once been Jean-Pierre's domain. He had always been fascinated by parachutes, long before the tragic accident, long before he even met me. He had even tried dropping animals, dogs mostly, from his earlier balloons, a practice I had found both morbid and utterly compelling. After his death, with the ever-present shadow of debt looming over me, I found myself returning to his notes, to his half-finished diagrams. The idea was simple: if I could not perform the daring, terrifying parachute jumps that balloonists like the Garnerin family were becoming famous for, if I could not risk my own life by plummeting from the sky, then I would make the sky itself a spectacle. My experiments began cautiously, first with weighted baskets, then with small, inert objects. Soon I was dropping actual dogs, just as Jean-Pierre had done, their little parachutes unfurling perfectly, guiding them gently to earth. The crowds, when they were present during the day, gasped and cheered at the sight, their applause a strange, distant echo of a joy I no longer fully felt, but a sound I now needed. Eventually, I took it a step further. Instead of animals, I began to drop baskets filled with dazzling fireworks, each attached to its own miniature parachute. As they drifted earthward, the pyrotechnics would ignite, showering the darkened landscape below with bursts of color and light, a breathtaking display that redefined the very nature of an aerial show. It was a silent, blazing defiance against the sorrow, a way to reclaim the spectacle, to make the sky my own stage, on my own terms. The financial strain was relentless. Every ascent consumed precious resources, every descent brought me back to the stark reality of Jean-Pierre's lingering debts. I had to be shrewd, resourceful. I chose a specific type of balloon, a hydrogen-filled gas balloon. It was smaller than many of the grander hot air contraptions, requiring less gas to inflate, and no constant fire to keep it aloft. This meant fewer crews, less fuel, smaller expenses. It was also inherently more stable, less prone to the sudden, terrifying descents that had claimed Jean-Pierre. Being small and light myself meant I required even less lifting power, a peculiar advantage in my new, solitary career. The gentle hiss of hydrogen filling the envelope became a familiar, comforting sound, a counterpoint to the thrumming anxiety that often gnawed at me on the ground. My reputation, however, began to soar. The unique spectacle of my night flights, the controlled, elegant descent of my firework displays, set me apart. While Elisa Garnerin, with her fearless parachute jumps, was drawing crowds and cementing her family's legacy, I was crafting a different kind of aerial artistry, one that suited my temperament and my terror of the crowds below. I preferred to be a shadowy presence, an unseen artist painting the night sky. Then came the Emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte, ever one to appreciate spectacle, efficiency, and a touch of the extraordinary, took notice. It was 1804 when I first received the summons, a terse official paper ordering my presence at the Tuileries. My hands trembled as I read it. The thought of entering such a grand, bustling palace, of facing a man of such immense power and presence, sent a visceral shudder through me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a familiar terror eclipsing all others. But the summons was not a request, it was a command. I remember that day with a stark clarity. The sheer volume of people, the echoing marble halls, the oppressive formality of the court. It was a waking nightmare. I wore my simplest dress, hoping to blend into the background, but my small stature and reputation meant I was inevitably singled out. Napoleon, surprisingly, was not the towering, fearsome figure I had imagined. He was shorter, stockier, with an intense, piercing gaze that nevertheless held a spark of genuine curiosity. "Madame Blanchard," he said, his voice surprisingly soft for a man who commanded armies. "Your work in the air is remarkable. Unique." I mumbled a polite, almost inaudible response, my eyes fixed on the floor, somewhere near the tips of his polished boots. He chuckled. "They say you are more comfortable among the stars than among your fellow men, eh? A curious trait for one who relies on public acclaim." I dared a glance up. "The sky, sire, is less demanding." He considered this, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps. But France is demanding. I require spectacle, grandeur. You are the only one who can provide it." And so, to my astonishment, I found myself appointed Aeronaut of the official festivals. Napoleon placed me in charge of organizing all aerial displays for his grand events. From coronation celebrations to military parades, it was my hydrogen balloon, often adorned with imperial eagles, that graced the skies, my fireworks that erupted in intricate patterns, my genius that painted light across the night. The irony was not lost on me. The woman most terrified of public gatherings was now the one orchestrating their most visible, most dazzling components. I learned to delegate, to manage, to plan from a distance, orchestrating the ground crews, ensuring everything was perfect, but always keeping my own persona veiled, save for my solitary ascent. The emperor even consulted me on matters of war, his ambition extending to the very heavens. He spoke of an aerial invasion of England, a flotilla of balloons carrying troops across the Channel. My blood ran cold at the folly of it. I listened patiently then, with a courage I rarely found for social interaction, but discovered readily when discussing the practicalities of the air. I laid out the stark realities. "Sire," I explained, "the winds over the Channel are fickle, treacherous. They cannot be commanded like your armies. A fleet of balloons would be scattered, each at the mercy of the currents. It would be a disaster, not an invasion." He listened, surprisingly. And eventually he conceded. The invasion plans were shelved. I had saved countless lives, perhaps even prevented a catastrophic humiliation for France, not with a sword or a cannon, but with the quiet, unyielding logic of the sky. The terror of crowds remained, an ever-present hum beneath my skin. But in the air, or when speaking of it, a different Sophie Blanchard emerged, sharp, confident, utterly fearless. The sky, once Jean-Pierre's domain and then my solitary sanctuary, was now becoming my throne, and I, Sophie Blanchard, was its undisputed queen. The emperor's pronouncement had, inexplicably, transformed my greatest weakness into my greatest strength. As aeronaut of the official festivals, my life became a whirlwind of preparation, yet paradoxically, my public exposure remained minimal. My presence was required for the planning, for the intricate calculations of wind and payload, for the meticulous design of the fireworks displays that would burst from my gondola like captive constellations. But when the time came for the spectacle itself, I was aloft, a distant, silent figure. The thousands below mere indistinct specks, their cheers a muted rumble that never quite penetrated my private world of cloud and sky. My first grand display under this new title was not long in coming. The Emperor's wedding to Marie-Louise in April 1810 demanded an unprecedented aerial ballet. Weeks of planning culminated in an evening where my balloon, a vast silken orb painted with golden eagles, ascended from the Champ de Mars, trailing ribbons of light as fireworks exploded from its very fabric. From my perch, high above the glittering capital, I released cascades of artificial flowers, their petals catching the moonlight as they drifted earthward, a silent benediction over the newfound imperial union. The roar from below was immense, a wave of sound that seemed to push against the very fabric of the balloon, yet inside my wicker basket, a profound quiet reigned, the silence of the heavens a stark contrast to the earthly celebration. Then came the birth of his son, the King of Rome, in March 1811. Paris was alight with anticipation, and then, joy. My instructions were precise. I was to be the first herald from the sky. As crowds thronged the streets, I ascended from the Tuileries gardens, carrying not just the hopes of an empire, but bundles of specially printed leaflets. My hands, usually so steady on the controls, trembled slightly as I released them over the city, watching them flutter down like confetti, announcing the news, "L'aiglon est né!" The wind, mercifully, carried them wide, ensuring every corner of the jubilant city received the airborne decree. Later, for the boy's baptism, I performed another ascension. A simpler, more solemn flight, a silent witness to the christening of a future emperor. Each flight solidified my unique position, an ethereal bridge between the emperor and his people, a silent messenger of his grandeur. But these aerial pronouncements, for all their imperial significance, were mere preludes to the true heart of my new role, the grand festival flights. None perhaps were more anticipated, or more fraught with internal dread for me, than the emperor's birthday celebration on August 15, 1811, in Milan. The very thought of Milan, a city teeming with life, sent shivers down my spine. The throngs, the noise, the suffocating presence of so many eyes. It was a waking nightmare. Yet, duty called. My team, a well-oiled machine of ground crew and gas engineers, had arrived days prior, meticulously preparing my colossal balloon. The chamois volant, as it was affectionately known, was a majestic sight, its vibrant silk shimmering under the Italian sun. On the appointed morning, the air in the Piazza del Duomo was thick with anticipation. Not for the first time. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, a prickle of sweat on my palms, despite the cool morning air. A sea of faces, a living, breathing tapestry of humanity, stretched as far as the eye could see. My gaze darted from one anonymous back to another, never settling, never making eye contact. General Joachim Murat, Napoleon's flamboyant brother-in-law and King of Naples, was among the dignitaries, his plumed hat catching the sun. I had met him earlier that year in Naples, under far less celebratory circumstances. He'd insisted on a flight despite a looming storm. And I, ever the professional, had obliged, battling fierce winds and torrential rain. A dance with death performed for an audience of one king and a handful of drenched onlookers. That flight had been terrifying, exhilarating, a true test of my mettle against nature's fury. This, however, this clamor, this crowd, it was a different kind of terror. Madame Blanchard. A booming voice cut through the din. It was my chief ground assistant, his face flushed with exertion. "The wind is stable, gas pressure excellent. You are ready for ascent." I nodded, attempting a reassuring smile that I knew felt more like a grimace. My focus narrowed, the world contracting to the familiar basket, the sturdy ropes, the burners hissing softly. This was my sanctuary, my escape. I climbed in, the woven wicker a familiar embrace, the controls responding to my touch with an almost living sentience. With a final, silent nod to the ground crew, I released the ballast. The ascent was always the same, a moment of gentle resistance, then a smooth, almost imperceptible lift. The cheers, which had been a deafening roar just moments before, began to recede, dwindling into a dull murmur, like the distant hum of a beehive. The faces below blurred, losing their individuality, transforming into abstract patterns of color. The weight in my chest eased, replaced by the familiar lightness of being airborne. The terror receded, replaced by a sublime exhilaration. Here, above the world, I was truly free. From my aerial vantage point, Milan unfurled beneath me like a detailed map, its ancient roofs and winding streets dwarfed by the majestic cathedral. The piazza, moments ago a suffocating crush of humanity, was now a neatly bordered square, its thousands of spectators reduced to glittering specks. I sent aloft my carefully constructed fireworks, cascades of gold and silver streaming against the brilliant blue, echoing the grandeur of the celebration below. My fame had, by this point, become something truly extraordinary. Just months before, in Frankfurt, my show had been so popular it had drawn crowds away from an opera performance, leaving the theater half empty. The irony was sweet. My silent, isolated performances commanded more attention than the most celebrated singers. Italy, especially, had embraced my ascensions with fervent enthusiasm. I had traversed the country, from city to city, the unique spectacle of my flights drawing masses. Earlier that year, I had flown from Rome to Naples, a journey across the Italian landscape that had tested my endurance. On another occasion, from Rome, I had ascended to an astonishing 12,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold, and the world below a hazy dream. I recalled drifting, a strange lethargy overcoming me, and later, the vague memory of having fallen asleep for a while, suspended between earth and sky. It was a perilous, yet oddly peaceful experience. Then there was the time I had soared high to avoid a sudden hailstorm, only to faint from the extreme altitude and lack of oxygen. I had drifted for 14.5 hours, unconscious for part of it, carried by the capricious winds, before regaining enough awareness to guide my balloon to a safe landing far from my starting point. Each time I pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible, not for glory, but for the profound freedom and clarity the air offered. My adventures had not been without their harrowing moments. On a trip to Turin in 1812, crossing the jagged peaks of the Alps, the cold had been so intense that my nose bled freely, and icicles had formed on my hands and face, sharp crystalline extensions of my very being. The balloon had become an ice palace, and I, its frozen queen. There were times I flirted with disaster, pushing the limits of endurance and engineering. Just a few years later, in 1817, during a flight from Nantes, I would nearly lose my life, landing in a marsh, my balloon snagged in a tree, my chair tipping, plunging me into the murky water. But even then, help arrived quickly, pulling me back from the brink. Yet, despite these close calls, the lure of the sky remained irresistible. Far above the grand piazzas and the cheering crowds, far from the judging eyes and the stifling press of bodies, I found my truest self. Up here, amidst the clouds and the endless blue, fear dissipated like morning mist. The only demands were those of the wind, the sun, and the delicate balance of my magnificent balloon. I was not Sophie Blanchard, the timid woman who flinched from a handshake, but Sophie Blanchard, the queen of the air, holding court in a boundless, silent kingdom. And as the Milan sun warmed my face, high above Napoleon's birthday celebrations, I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this was where I was meant to be, suspended between the mundane world and the infinite, forever chasing the horizon. The unshakable certainty I felt, suspended above Milan, was a fragile thing, however. It was a promise whispered by the wind, easily shattered by the clamor of the ground. For all my fame, for all the crowds that flocked to see me, the moment before an ascension always gnawed at me with an insidious anxiety. The murmuring masses, a sea of expectant faces, felt like a judgment. Their eyes, 1,000 tiny needles, pricked at the fragile membrane of my composure. I could navigate storms, survive 14 hours adrift, and brave icy altitudes, but a simple promenade through a bustling market could turn my stomach to knots. This paradox, this chasm between my terrestrial terror and my aerial courage, was the secret core of my existence. And so it was, on this fateful evening of July 6, 1819, that I found myself once again at the Tivoli Gardens in Paris. The air, thick with the scent of summer dust and cheap perfume, vibrated with a feverish anticipation. The gas lamps flickered, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to mock my unease. I heard the whispers, the eager chatter for the spectacle, but also the concerned voices. "Madame Blanchard, the wind is strong this evening. Are you sure about the fireworks, ma'am? They say it's too much." The warnings, they pricked at me like nettles. I had heard them countless times before. Fireworks were my signature, the fiery crown to my celestial performances. They made the impossible, the silent ascent, visible, dazzling for the eager eyes below. How could I deny them? How could I deny myself the added challenge, the thrill of pushing the edge? Jean-Pierre, my beloved husband, had taught me the sky. He had soared first, and I, ever his devoted shadow, had followed. After his passing, the sky became my solace, my sanctuary, a living tribute to his memory. It was where I felt closest to him, utterly free. But freedom, I had learned, came at a price. It demanded greater risks, bolder displays to keep the public enthralled, to keep the dream alive. I smoothed the white silk of my dress, adjusted the ostentatious ostrich feathers on my hat. A uniform really, for the Queen of the Air. But tonight, it felt heavy, suffocating. The small wicker chair connected to the hydrogen balloon felt less like a throne and more like a cage, albeit one leading to freedom. My heart hammered, not from fear of the flight, but from the crushing weight of expectation, the sheer presence of so many people. I yearned for the solitude of the upper atmosphere, where the air was clean and cold, and the only audience was the infinite expanse of the stars. A gentleman, pale with concern, reached out, his hand hovering, as if to physically restrain me. "Madame, please reconsider," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Others, however, shouted their impatience, their desire for the show to begin. It was a familiar tug-of-war, played out before every flight. I looked at the vast bulbous shape of my balloon, glowing faintly in the dim light, tethered impatiently. "Let's go," I heard myself say. The words a strange mixture of resignation and defiance. "This will be for the last time." I didn't know why I said it. Perhaps it was the weariness of the public gaze, the endless cycle of performance, or a fleeting premonition. But the words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy even I didn't fully comprehend. The ground crew released the ropes. The wind indeed was strong, tugging at the balloon, making it sway. I felt the familiar lurch, the delicate shift as the earth released its grip. The initial ascent was sluggish, the balloon struggling against the unseen currents. I leaned over the edge of my wicker chair, a familiar gesture, and began to jettison sandbags one by one. Each hiss of escaping sand was a small victory, a shedding of earthly weight. Slowly, painstakingly, the balloon gained height, climbing above the tallest trees that ringed the Tivoli gardens. As I cleared the last leafy branch, I unfurled my flag, a white banner that billowed proudly in the wind. A wave of cheers rose from below, a distant, muffled roar that now sounded almost like applause. My heart, which had been a drumbeat of anxiety moments before, settled into its familiar peaceful rhythm. Up here, the world simplified. The crowds became indistinct specks, the buildings miniature toys. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind against the fabric of the balloon, and the gentle creak of the wicker. This was my domain. This was where I belonged. It was 10:30. A perfect summer night, save for the persistent wind. I looked down at the Tivoli gardens, a glittering tapestry of lights below. My cue. I reached for the fuses, prepared to ignite the Bengal fires. The slow-burning colored fireworks suspended in baskets around the balloon's base. They were designed to cast a magical glow, transforming my silent ascent into a celestial beacon. The first fuse sputtered, then caught, sending a shower of emerald sparks into the night. Beautiful. I drew a breath, savoring the moment. Then another, and another. But as the third and fourth ignited, a searing bright orange flare burst not outwards, but upwards. My blood ran cold. A gasp caught in my throat. A tree branch, unseen in the hurried ascent, must have shifted one of the baskets, or perhaps the stronger wind had twisted a wire. The firework, instead of arcing gracefully into the sky, shot directly at the hydrogen-filled envelope above me. A sickening, tearing sound. A flash of blinding light. The whisper of the wind was instantly replaced by a roaring, infernal blaze. The gas inside the balloon, my lifeblood of the sky, was igniting. My magnificent silent kingdom was consumed in a maelstrom of flame. The air, which had been my ally, now turned treacherous, pulling me down with terrifying speed. A bizarre calm descended upon me. It was not fear, not exactly, more a profound, almost detached, understanding. I was still Sophie Blanchard, the Queen of the Air, but my crown was now fire, and my throne, a plummeting inferno. Below, the cheering had not stopped. They thought it part of the show, a spectacular, fiery descent. Oh, the irony. They had no idea. My instincts, honed by years of close calls, took over. Even with the gas burning, there was still some lift, some resistance against gravity. It was not a free fall, not yet. I scrabbled for the remaining ballast, throwing out bags of sand with frantic, precise movements. 1, 2, 3. Anything to slow the inevitable, to gain a moment, a breath. The fiery descent lessened its pace, transformed from a plunge into a controlled, if terrifying, glissade. I remained upright in my chair, my gaze fixed on the receding, yet rapidly approaching, lights below. The roar of the flames was deafening now, a hungry beast devouring my beautiful balloon. The heat was scorching, singeing the feathers of my hat, the edges of my dress. The hydrogen, a volatile friend, was now my executioner. I could see the rooftops of Rue de Provence rushing up to meet me, their slate tiles glinting under the moon. So close. Could I make it? Could I land it on a roof, perhaps scramble to safety? Hope. A fleeting bird fluttered in my chest. The balloon, a fiery husk, grazed the eaves of a building, a jarring jolt. I braced myself for impact, for the collision that would surely tear the gondola from the burning fabric. There was a sickening lurch, a sharp crack. The ropes, weakened by the intense heat, or perhaps severed by the impact, snapped. My chair, my precious anchor, was ripped away. One moment I was suspended, tangled within the burning net, above the roof. The next, the world spun. The dream of floating, the ecstasy of flight, dissolved into pure, raw acceleration. I was no longer the queen of the air, but a broken bird, plummeting, untethered, towards the unyielding embrace of the cobblestones below. The last sensation was a breath, expelled, then nothing. A sudden, violent darkness, deeper and more absolute than any night sky. The only sound, the distant, muffled cheers, now transformed into screams. The show, at last, was truly over.